It's time now for the news review of this bulletin. Russia has accused the U.S. of being behind a drone strike on the Kremlin, which officials in Moscow say was aimed at killing President Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin spokesman said Russia is aware of the plot, knows that Washington is selecting the targets, and that Ukraine is merely implementing them. Dmitry Peskov added that Russia is considering various options to respond that meet the interests of the country. The U.S. dismissed Russia's allegation, saying Moscow's assertion was a lie. Russia has already blamed the attack on Ukraine, describing it as a failed terrorist act. Kiev has rejected the accusation. Meanwhile, Russian missiles targeted the Ukrainian capital Kiev again. Ukrainian officials said the southern Zaporizhzhia region and the port city of Odessa were also shelled by the Russian military. Harley Schlanger, spokesman at the International Schiller Institute, joins us from Potsdam, Germany. We also have DeBar, who's an activist and commentator, joining us from Ossining, New York. Gentlemen, welcome. Harley Schlanger, first over to you. So you have this incident that has happened, and it's interesting the type of reaction that we've had from Ukraine and in turn the U.S. But what are your thoughts? Do you think that this is true, what Russia has accused the U.S. of, that it was the plot that it devised and for Ukraine to have carried it out?
Well, it's important to realize that Ukraine would not undertake such a risky act as this without clearing it from the United States first. So the idea that the United States had no idea or that they have plausible deniability is possible. But I don't think if this came from Kiev directly, which it appears to, that this would have been without the knowledge of the United States. Now, one of the strongest evidence of Ukrainian government involvement has been the targeting in Kiev of the May 9th Victory Day celebrations in Moscow, which of course are highly symbolic for Putin and the Russian people, the victory over the Nazis. And given that you have neo-Nazis inside the Ukrainian security and defense forces and in the government, this may be something that they do wish to target. A man named Anton Gerashenko, who is a spokesman for the Interior Ministry of Ukraine and one of the co-founders of the Mirotvorets hit list, he was on Twitter all day yesterday talking about what a great event this was, and his last tweet was, "Will Russia now cancel the parade on May 9th, or will they wait for a drone during it?" So I think this is at least plausible evidence of Ukrainian involvement, just as Biden's comments that the Nord Stream pipelines will not be open was used by Seymour Hersh in his targeting of the Biden administration as responsible for the sabotage of the pipelines.
And what do you think, Don DeBar? Do you agree with Harley Schlanger there? What would be the real intention of if the U.S. was to have orchestrated it and for Kiev to have carried it out?
I'll further amplify, first of all, the reference to Biden and the Nord Stream pipeline. Biden says we're going to take out the Nord Stream pipeline. Boom, the Nord Stream pipeline is gone. Biden, before he mentioned the Nord Stream pipeline, had said essentially Putin should not be allowed to be president of Russia anymore. That was on like March of last year. But further than that, it's the policy of the U.S. government. Well, there's proposed legislation to make this official, but you have what's called the Helsinki Group inside the U.S. government, which has members of Congress and others in it, whose purpose, the avowed purpose of the U.S. government, is to decolonize Russia. By meaning that, by saying that, they mean to break it up into like 10 independent countries of each other. They've announced a regime change effort from the very beginning of the addressing of the Ukraine situation by that group. And there is pending legislation now in both houses of Congress introduced last week that says, in essence, it is the policy, in fact, the states, it's the policy of the United States to make sure that Ukraine wins this war, recovers all of its lost territories, quote unquote, which includes a naval base of Russia's that's been there since the end of the 1700s, which means essentially a declaration of war on Russia. Finally, just in terms of how crazy is the idea, Robert F. Kennedy has already said, who's a presidential candidate who is climbing very rapidly up in the polls every time he opens his mouth on these matters, said in essence, or asked in essence, if Russia were to back a change of regime in Mexico and then provide military aid, and that military aid was used in one fashion or another to shoot drones at the White House, what would Washington's response be, and would Russia be involved in the chain of response? So, we're playing with World War III here. We're playing with a nuclear war because a regime change, a decapitation of the state is one of the two conditions under which Russia has, in its nuclear doctrine, said we'll use nuclear weapons. A, if they're used against us, and B, if the survival of our state is threatened. And I can't think of a more threatening act than decapitating the state.
Harley Schlanger, what do you think we may expect from Russia on this?
Well, I think it's important to realize that Putin has been very deliberate over the year and some months in the operation, sticking to this idea of a special military operation. The Russians will be very cool in their response. They'll track down as much as they can where this might have come from. But I think it's important what the other guest just pointed out. The policy of the U.S. toward Russia is regime change. It's to stop Russia's leadership of the move toward de-dollarization and the global South's alliance with Russia and China against the West. And furthermore, the NATO expansion eastward has had as its target from the beginning preventing Russia from recovering from the disasters imposed on it by the Yeltsin shock therapy policies. So Russia has been targeted. And yet what I think the Russians are figuring is that this so-called counteroffensive from Ukraine is mired in problems, lack of weapons, lack of men, material, and the growing dissatisfaction in the West, particularly in Europe, with the war. So many things are on Russia's side, and I'll just finally point out that Western media is saying Putin is desperate, so Russia might have done this as a false flag to justify escalation. Putin's not desperate. It's Ukraine that's desperate, and this was stated by people like Larry Johnson, a CIA veteran, Scott Ritter. It's the counteroffensive which is causing desperation and fear, as indicated in the Pentagon leaks, that all this aid going to Ukraine is not going to win the war. And in the meantime, as the guest pointed out, the Congress has this Ukraine Victory Act, where just today another $300 million was allocated by the Biden administration for weapons for Ukraine. So the desperation is on the Western side. Putin has many of the cards in his hand, and I think he's going to play them coolly.
All right, you both have mentioned this regime change policy of the U.S. So, Don DeBar, regime change policy for Syria, failed. Regime change policy for Iran, failed. Venezuela, failed. What would the U.S. think it would work with Russia?
Well, I guess the neocons are pointing to Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi, among others. Mel Zelaya, whatever mode they use to remove them. There's an interesting documentary running on one of the networks that has to do with the U.S. Revolution Factory. I think it's called the Revolutions Factory or something, that deals with these issues. But honestly, it's insanity to think that there's going to be regime change. They tried this drone thing on Nicolas Maduro. I remember a year or two or three ago. It failed. It was in a stadium out in the open, and they missed.
Right.
The idea that they could sneak something in, although I did recall Matthew Roost's flight into the Red Square back in the 80s in a Cessna, that it was publicized at least that he had successfully evaded the Soviet air defenses coming from Finland, although some said that they actually picked it up and they were tracking him, and it was just a decision not to engage him. In any event, it caused a stir and a shakeup in the leadership of the military at the time. And so it's quite possible that even though they are thinking maybe we'll get him, like they tried with Fidel Castro 1,000 times, but if not, we could still make an awful lot of trouble for for the situation in our information war. The people in Moscow wondering, looking up at the sky in his something coming in or whatever. You can cause a lot of trouble doing this, and they cause trouble wherever they go. And so even though they missed, I'm sure somebody's patting somebody on the back and getting a bonus check.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Don DeBar, activist and commentator. Harley Schlanger, thank you, spokesman at the International Schiller Institute. Thank you to you both.
Thank you.
And with that, we come to an end for this edition of the News Review. Thanks for tuning in.